is this fine if I,
Yes.
yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, teacher voice. Let me just do the, there's like actually a very, I hear myself coming back to me here in terms of the acoustics. So, I've known Steven here, how long? 8 years? 8 years. So every time I see him now in the community, it makes me feel quite a bit older. I thought I was young when I met him, but now he's doing the work that I was doing with him as the adult, as an adult. And so when we worked together, it was part of the Youth for Change Alliance in Providence, and at the time it was an alliance between 5 different youth organizations, PrYSM being one of them. One of our colleagues at the time, another young person named Olu, who was with Youth in Action, who will be coming shortly, not her, but Youth in Action, she used to say, and we used to think about on our steering committee that was majority young people, 10 young people, 10 high school students to 5 adults, that she was sick of hearing people talk about high schoolers and teenagers as our leaders of tomorrow, right? Because she's like, we're doing it now. We're leading now. We're the leaders. We need tomorrow, but we're also the leaders today. And so I always think about that sort of lesson that I was taking in my sort of early 30s at the time, and sort of in learning from all the young people and with all the young people that I was working with. So that's why I just sort of put in just in terms of, well, we can do this double entendres all day, I guess. So the leaders of tomorrow are here today, like quite literally here in the room, but they're already doing this work out in the streets and in our community. So I'm going to spend some time, 15 minutes of time, start me now, don't count the crazy. So I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit sort of, I guess, theoretically. My research is in, specifically in teacher activism, but I spend a lot of time thinking about the pedagogy of activism and sort of how we understand what it means to be an activist and to do activism, to become an activism, to live as an activist. And so I'm going to sort of be drawing from some of the thinking that I've been doing that really started with classroom teachers, but applying it to the youth-led activism that I'm also very connected to here historically in this city, but also currently in my position. We do a lot of support work with all of the organizations that are going to be presenting today. So this, you don't have to, we can send the slides out, I guess. I see a lot of note takers. So this is a very, this is a Venn diagram which makes it look official. It's a framework for the pedagogy of teacher activism, but I'm thinking about how it applies more broadly, like I said, so outside classrooms and just to activism and activists in general. So sort of relabeled here as activist pedagogy. It's taken from work that I've been doing for quite some time now. Those of you that go into a doctoral program, I'm one of we call your classmates, I'm a D1, it's my first doctoral year, I'm a D2, I'm a D3, then there's D dinosaur, which is what I became. So many years, this beautiful Venn diagram, the color palette was really hard to come up with. So this is the representation of work. I'm going to back up to think about 2 ideas that I've been applying to this framework, and then walk quickly through the framework in the context of youth activism, and hopefully then I'll be done. So underneath the work that I've been thinking about lies a lot of work that came before, but very specifically been thinking a lot with some colleagues who also do thinking around teacher activism and education activism about Gloria Anzaldua's work, Borderlands La Frontera. And it's a seminal work in feminist theory and beyond. And so if you have not been assigned it or read it, then please go check that out. You can actually, the whole manuscript is actually online somewhere if you Google it. She has an idea in this book called choque. And her description is here, but essentially a choque is a cultural collision, right? So folks who are not of the mainstream dominant culture straddle realities, right? Move through with the reality that's true for them and continuously come up against the normative structures around us that don't accept the reality of who they are, and then there's a collision, right? And so I think when we think about activism, oftentimes activism is a response to a choking. It's a response to this collision when we have a reality that we know true to ourselves as young people, as people of color, as women, as anyone from sort of a marginalized and oppressed identity coming up against a reality that is not accepting of who we are, and so then we can either do something about it or shut down. There's a lot of things in between. And this sort of builds a sensibility in folks that are continuously coming up against these collisions, right? So when I'm talking to teachers and educators, I'm often thinking about how are we mitigating these collisions in our classrooms, right? How are we not replicating those structures inside of our classrooms so that the young people that are in our classrooms aren't constantly ramming up against the things that we're doing that are actually replications of the mainstream dominant work that is continuously challenging who they are and what they're bringing to the table. I think the activism of the youth organizations that we're going to hear about in many ways are their own cultivated responses to the fact that the city of Providence, the United States of Rhode Island, the United States isn't often set up in ways that are accepting of who they are. And we are more broadly. Sort of in almost way that builds upon these experiences, these cultural collisions, is this other idea of la facultad. And la facultad is something that folks who are oppressed begin to develop, and Ansel Dua talks about it almost as a sixth sense, right? So that there's this idea that, I keep running up against some stuff, so then, now I develop a sensibility where I actually begin to see in the surface phenomena the deeper meaning and reality, right? So we sense when there's a slight and a comment made to us that on its surface might feel completely innocuous, but you've heard it enough to know there's an insult underneath there, right? Where if you looked at stuff like microaggressions, right? A lot of that is underneath this, it's built up. And the person saying something, well, I didn't mean anything by it. You might not have intentionally meant something by it. You might not have realized you were the 15th person today to say something exactly the same, right? And there's all of these different pieces, but there's a sixth sense. I always think like the most easy one for me was growing up in Rhode Island, getting asked where I was from all the time, where I was from all the time, where are you from, where are you from, where are you from. That's a coded way, obviously, of not asking where I'm actually from, which is South Kingstown, Rhode Island, right? But then, well, where's your family from? Pawtucket and Long Island, New York, right? Like so, but and you can draw that out with people, and they're like frustrated because you know what they're asking. They know what they're asking. They don't know how to ask it, and so that's sort of. But there's a sense like right away when I was young, I always knew that was not what people were asking me, right? And I had to decide how I was going to answer. That's a very sort of just almost like surface, very common thing that we're developing. But that was me as a young person developing this facultad, this idea, this sense of like, oh no, they're really trying to place me, I didn't have this thought when I was like 6 or 7, but they're really trying to place me in some social order. They're trying to make sense of this sort of ambiguous phenotype in front of you. I'm Chinese and Italian, for those who are like, where is he from? So there's this whole this built-up sense that I have. And so then, as a person of color, and I'm going to see nods from people of color in this room, we walk in a room and we scan, and we right away judge whether or not this is a place that we're going to feel comfortable in by the hue of the room, right? We look, we count, we know whether we're right, whether we're wrong, whether that's right, whether that's wrong. It's a sense, and it's been learned, right, over time. Ansel Dua, it writes a lot about experiences of women, specifically queer women of color, but women, she uses in La Facultad, in describing it, she talks about how women have a sense, the sense of safety and security, right? Like men, we're walking around, we don't have a second thought walking across campus later when it's dark, right? Women are checking surroundings. Men's facultad about that is it's undeveloped, right? But women know when you walk into a room. No, I'm like, can I get in that elevator or not? Right? And so when we develop these deeper senses of what the reality is, and we're combining them with these sort of this cultural collision that we're constantly faced with, one response is to look to change that, right? And we can call that activism. So activism to me has three major things. There's a purpose to activism. Little PrYSM shout out on the picture here. That's the PrYSM logo for those of you that don't know it. Again, with the multiple meanings of words, I played with this idea in developing our purpose of apprehension. Right? So these feelings that we have when we're colliding culturally, when we're sensing this deeper reality that isn't quite right or isn't quite for us, it creates an apprehension in one meaning of the word. An anxiety, a fear that something bad or unpleasant will happen. Right? We're anxious about something. However, a second meaning of the word apprehension, and Paulo Freire, for those education students that have read his work, talks about apprehending the world. It means understanding, right? And so one of the things I've been playing with is our anxious sort of fear, our vulnerabilities, if we sit with them, if we explore them, if we understand them, actually lead to deeper understanding. And that's la facultad, right? So we can understand better, and if we understand better, we can act with purpose. And that's sort of I've been sort of fascinated with this idea of apprehension, especially in these revolting times. Right? How many of us had a pit in our stomach the morning after the election? Right? How many of us didn't know? I mean, I know people who have panic, like legit panic attacks. Right? So this is a feeling of apprehension. So fear is that we don't know. Now we can sit in that or we can do something. And that's where we get to the next piece, where you're trying to build power. It's about our agency. We can create, we can resist, we can relate, right? So we can build things together, we can resist things together, and we can build with each other. And this, speaking of the election, was the day of inauguration, where the Providence Student Union and Youth in Action jointly organized with support of PrYSM, and other youth organizations and high schoolers from all over the city, a walkout at the moment of inauguration. And this was the scene on the State House steps that morning in January. This was an action to me that really built all of these kinds of agencies together. They created something new, of their own response to this phenomena that went on without their vote, right? They created, this was an act of resistance. They walked out of school. This is a relational act. It actually was building community across youth from across the city. And actually from this, I took this picture from here, and this was all the adults that I knew in Providence who do solidarity work with youth activists were in that part of the crowd. And we were connecting, reconnecting. I hadn't seen people for months or even years in some of them, and like realizing how come we're not connecting. And in these times maybe we need to. And then it moves us into possibility, right? Which I really frame as different kinds of hope. That we need a sense of hope and possibility. We can't only be organizing and activating against a reality. We can't only be resisting. We have to create, right? And in that creation, there's a sense of possibility and hope. If we don't have a sense of possibility and hope, if we can't instill that in the people around us, if we can't instill that through our work, then what's the point, right? We have to have a vision. And if you look around the country, that vision, and if you look historically, right, that vision comes from young people, including most of the people in this room, right, 25 and under. That's where historically the vision for change has come from, right? And the most referenced, kind of flashpoint of change in our modern times, right, in the U.S. is the civil rights movement. Most of the hard work was coming from young people, right? So when I think about like what Martin Luther King was doing, when he was by 30 years old, I always felt that when I was a grad student, I was like, man, what am I doing over here? Finish already. So young people have always and these are pictures of things just all relevant, all now. that are being led by young people, with the middle being, and I don't know if you're going to talk about it, Stephen, but the Providence Community Safety Act, which was a recent piece of legislation that was passed in the city of Providence with the strong support and multi-year campaign, many-year campaign that PrYSM was at the center of. But giving sense of possibility, young people, I think, are the best at that, right? As we get older, our imaginations might get a little stunted, or we just feel constrained by the realities of mortgages and college tuitions to support. So you don't blame your parents; they try to support. But that's part of, I think, why young people have always had this clear sense of hope and possibility. And I think those of us who might not identify as young folks in the room need to understand that it's really our responsibility to continue to instill that sense of hope and possibility. So that was really all I was going to frame, but so I just got my 2-minute warning. So, as we listen to the young folks from Providence Student Union and PrYSM and Youth in Action, what I want to challenge us to do is to hear or listen for the times or in their stories and their comments of what they do, where are we sensing those collisions that they're responding to? What's their sense? What's the deeper sense of reality that they're facing in their schools and in the Providence community that they're shedding light upon, that if we weren't listening to that sort of sense that they have, we would miss, right? And then what can we build from that, right? How should the stories that they tell really help us clarify what's our purpose, right? What do I want to do? How am I going to do it? What's my apprehension? What's my fear? What's my anxiety? How can I turn that into an understanding? And then what kind of power am I going to build with that? What are we going to create? What are we going to resist? Who am I going to relate to in order to do it? And then what sense of hope and possibility does that really leave us with? And if we can actually move through that together, and if you can move through that for yourself and with others, there's a reason Dr. King called it a beautiful struggle. Talib Kweli later, for those hip-hop heads. That's even dating me, probably. But there's a reason that it can be beautiful, and it is